The wind in the borderlands of North Texas did not simply blow, it scoured. It possessed a grit and a persistence that felt personal, stripping the paint from the siding of the few buildings in Dry Fork and working the red dust into the very seams of a person's soul. It was late August of the year 1889, and the heat still clung to the earth with the desperation of a lover who refused to say goodbye. Clara Bennett stood on the porch of what was generously called the schoolhouse, shielding her eyes against the glare. The structure was little more than a weathered gray box dropped onto the prairie, listing slightly to the west as if it were trying to lean away from the relentless gusts. The windows were clouded with grime, and the door hung on leather hinges that groaned every time the wind picked up. Inside, there were 6 benches, a cast-iron stove that looked as if it had not held a fire in a decade, and a single blackboard with a crack running down its center like a scar. Clara brushed the dust from her skirt. She was 26 years old, an age where most women in the territory were already mothers of 3 or 4, their skin leathery from the sun and their dreams narrowed to the next harvest. Clara, however, had the smooth, pale hands of someone who held books more often than reins, though her jawline suggested she was not as fragile as her hands implied. She had come here from St. Louis, leaving behind a life of predictable comfort for a salary of $30 a month and a room at the back of the widow Miller's boarding house. She stepped inside the classroom, the floorboards sighing under her boots. The air smelled of stale pine and mouse droppings. She walked to the front of the room and picked up a piece of chalk from the tray. It was a small, broken nub, no longer than the joint of her thumb. This was the ammunition she had been given to fight a war against ignorance and hatred. "It will have to do," she whispered to herself. Her voice sounded small in the empty room, swallowed by the vast silence of the plains outside. The first day of school arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. The children trickled in, wary and watchful. There were 15 of them in total. Most were the children of homesteaders and cattle hands, wearing shirts made of flour sacks and boots that had been patched 3 times over. But there were others, too. 3 children from the nearby reservation sat clustered in the back corner, their eyes dark and darting, expecting a blow before a lesson. Clara stood at the front, her hands clasped before her. She wore her best blue dress, the collar starched stiff. She waited for the murmurs to die down. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and carrying to the back of the room. "My name is Miss Bennett. In this room, we are scholars. Outside these walls, the world may judge you by your name, or your boots, or your father's money. But here, you are judged only by the effort of your mind and the kindness of your heart." A boy in the second row snorted. He was older, perhaps 12, with a shock of corn-yellow hair and the arrogant slouch of a boy who mimicked his father too well. His name was Thomas. "My PA says this is a waste of time," Thomas announced, looking back at the corner where the 3 native children sat. "Pa says you can't teach a savage to read any more than you can teach a coyote to sing hymns." The room went deadly silent. The children in the back corner did not move, but Clara saw their shoulders tense, a collective bracing for the inevitable agreement of the room. Clara did not raise her voice. She did not frown. She walked slowly down the aisle, the heels of her boots clicking a steady rhythm on the wood. She stopped at Thomas's desk. The boy looked up, a challenge in his eyes, waiting for the lecture. Instead, Clara placed her hand gently on his shoulder. It was not a grip of punishment, but a touch of firm, unyielding presence. She held his gaze until he blinked and looked away. "Your father is entitled to his opinion on his own land." "Thomas," Clara said softly, "but this is my land. And on my land, we do not use words that make our neighbors feel small. We build, we do not tear down." She left her hand there for a moment longer, letting the warmth of her palms sink through the rough fabric of his shirt, a signal that she was not rejecting him, but she would not yield to him either. Then she turned and walked back to the blackboard. "Now," she said, picking up the nub of chalk, "who can tell me the capital of the United States?" She saw one of the native girls in the back hesitate, then slowly, tentatively, raise a hand. It was a small victory, fragile as a bird's wing, but it was enough for the first morning. By the end of the first week, Clara realized that the battle was not just inside the classroom. She had requested a shipment of supplies months ago: primers, slates, a new map of the territories, blankets for the winter months, and basic medical supplies like quinine and bandages. The letter from the Education Board confirmed they had been sent, but the shelves in the small storage closet remained bare. On Saturday morning, Clara walked into town. Dry Fork was essentially one wide, rutted street lined with false front buildings. There was a general store, a livery stable, 2 saloons that faced each other like duelists, and a small church that looked like it was praying for rain. She went straight to the general store, which also served as the post office. The air inside was thick with the smell of coffee beans and cured tobacco. The shopkeeper, a balding man named Mr. Higgins, was wiping down the counter with a rag that looked greasier than the wood. "Good morning, Mr. Higgins," Clara said. "I am checking again on the freight wagon from the east. The school supplies," Higgins didn't look up, "has not come in, Miss Bennett. It has been 3 weeks since the date on the manifest." Clara pressed. "Surely it cannot take this long to cross from the railhead." Higgins paused, chewing on the inside of his cheek. He glanced toward the door, then lowered his voice. "Look, Miss, the wagon came through. It went to the agency warehouse first, standard procedure for anything designated for the territory improvement." "The Indian agency?" Clara frowned. "But those supplies are for the town school, not just the reservation." "Silas Crow handles all the freight manifests," Higgins said, returning to his wiping. "If he says it got lost or damaged or misdirected, well, then it is lost. You would do best not to go asking too many questions. A young woman alone out here does not want to attract the wrong kind of attention." "But the children need books," Clara said, her voice rising slightly. "They need blankets. The stove needs repair parts. People out here learn to make do," Higgins said with finality. "Or they leave." Clara walked out of the store, her blood humming with a quiet fury. Silas Crow. She had heard the name whispered since she arrived. The Indian agent, the man who held the keys to the warehouse and, it seemed, the throat of the valley. As she stepped off the boardwalk, a shadow fell across her path. A rider was passing by on a paint horse that looked lean and hard-muscled. The rider was a man, perhaps 32 or 33 years old. He wore trousers made of buckskin and a faded blue shirt that had seen better years. His hair was black, cut short in the manner of the Scouts, but he wore no hat, letting the sun beat down on a face that seemed carved from mahogany. The town of Dry Fork was busy on a Saturday, with ranch hands and farmers bustling about. But around this rider, there was a bubble of silence. People stepped back. They did not greet him. Their eyes followed him with a mixture of fear and a strange, hungry curiosity. He sat his horse with an easy grace, his body moving in perfect rhythm with the animal. But his eyes were what caught Clara. They were dark, set deep under a strong brow, and they did not look at the people. They scanned the rooftops, the alleyways, the horizon. They were the eyes of a man who expected an ambush in every shadow. He pulled his horse up at the hitching rail near the hardware store, dismounting in one fluid motion. He tied the reins and patted the horse's neck, a gesture of tenderness that seemed at odds with the knife strapped to his thigh. Clara stood frozen. She had seen Comanche men before, mostly near the agency, looking defeated and weary. This man did not look defeated. He looked solitary. He walked past her, and for a fleeting second, his gaze flickered to hers. There was no recognition, no warmth, just a flat assessment of her presence, a woman, a teacher likely. Soft hands, no threat, and then he moved on. "That is Tall Redbird," a voice said beside her. Clara started. It was Deputy Owen Hart, a young man with a kind face and a badge that looked too shiny for his dusty vest. He was a scout for the Army, back in the wars. Owen said quietly, watching the man disappear into the hardware store. Now, he is just a ghost, lives out by the old creek bed, keeps to himself. Why do people look at him like that? Clara asked. Because he is a reminder, Owen said, of what we took and what is still out there, and mostly because he walks like he doesn't know he is supposed to be beaten. Clara watched the door of the hardware store. Tall Redbird. The name settled in her mind, heavy and distinct. The following week, the wind blew harder, rattling the loose shingles of the schoolhouse roof like bones in a cup. Clara taught reading using the only book she had, her own Bible, and taught arithmetic using pebbles she had gathered from the riverbed. She began to pay closer attention to the quiet girl in the back row, Lila. Lila was 10 years old, with skin the color of polished copper and hair braided into 2 tight plaits that hung down her back. She possessed a stillness that the other children lacked. While the settler boys fidgeted and the girls whispered, Lila sat with her hands folded, her dark eyes fixed on Clara, during the hour allocated for penmanship, while the other children struggled to copy letters onto their slates. Clara noticed Lila drawing. She walked softly down the aisle and stood behind the girl. Lila was not writing the alphabet. She was using a precious nub of chalk to sketch on her slate. It was a picture of a horse, rearing up on its hind legs, its mane flowing like water. Beside it, she had drawn a winding line, a river, and tall grass that seemed to bend in the wind. The detail was extraordinary for a child. The horse looked alive, angry and free. Clara leaned down. That is beautiful. Lila. The girl jumped, her hand jerking, smudging the horse's leg. She looked up, terror wide in her eyes, and quickly tried to wipe the slate clean with her sleeve. No, do not erase it, Clara said gently, catching the girl's wrist. It is wonderful art. You have a gift. Lila stared at her, breathing shallowly. She slowly lowered her hand. Do you like horses? Clara asked, crouching down so she was eye level with the child. Lila nodded. A small movement. Does your father have horses? The reaction was instant. Lila stiffened as if she had been struck. She looked down at her desk, her shoulders hunching inward. I live with my auntie, she whispered. Her English was perfect, accentless, but spoken so softly Clara had to lean in to hear. And your parents? Clara asked, her voice keeping a conversational lightness. Gone, Lila said. The word was a wall. It was not dead, and it was not away. It was simply gone. Outside, a group of older boys from the town were passing by the open window. One of them shouted something, a harsh, guttural mimicking of a war whoop, followed by laughter. Lila flinched. It was a visceral reaction, her head ducking, her hands gripping the edge of the desk until her knuckles turned yellow-white. Clara stood up and walked to the window. She stared out at the boys until they fell silent and shuffled away under her glare. When she turned back, Lila was watching her with an expression Clara could not quite read. It was not gratitude, exactly. It was a shock. That afternoon, after the children had gone, Clara stayed behind to clean. The schoolhouse felt vast in the twilight. She wiped the blackboards, the white chalk dust settling over her hands and the dark fabric of her dress. It coated everything a fine, pale powder that represented the only weapon she had. She went to the stove to empty the ash. The fire had burned out hours ago. This stove, she thought, was the only thing that made this drafty box a sanctuary. When the fire was lit, the children gathered around it. And in that circle of warmth, the difference between a rancher's son and a reservation daughter seemed to melt away, if only for 10 minutes. It was the center of civilization here. Not the law books, not the sheriff's gun, but the fire that kept the cold out. Clara walked to the door and looked out toward the west. The sun was setting, bleeding crimson and violet across the horizon. The prairie stretched out, endless and indifferent. Somewhere out there was the creek that marked the boundary between the town's designated land and the reservation. A line of water that decided who was a citizen and who was a ward of the state. She thought of the empty shelves in the closet. She thought of Silas Crow, a man she had not yet met but whose shadow lay over her school. And she thought of the man on the paint horse, tall Redbird, buying nails in a town that wished him gone. Clara Bennett had come west expecting hardship. She had expected snakes, tornadoes, and loneliness, but she had not expected this specific, heavy silence that covered the town like a suffocating blanket. She rubbed the chalk dust between her thumb and forefinger. It felt gritty, like the earth itself. "I am not leaving," she said to the empty prairie. She stepped back inside and latched the door. The latch was loose. The screws were stripping out of the dry wood. It would need fixing soon. She made a mental note to ask around for someone who could work with wood, someone who wouldn't charge her $3 she didn't have. As she walked home to the boarding house, the wind picked up again, swirling the red dust around her skirts. In the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely, shivering sound that rose and fell in the darkness. Clara pulled her shawl tighter. She did not know that a mile away, by the bend of the creek, a man sat by a small fire, whittling a piece of cedar into the shape of a horse, his ears tuned to the wind, listening for threats that were far more dangerous than coyotes. The night settled over Dry Fork, uneasy and watchful. The board was set, though the players did not yet know the game had begun. The following Monday brought a heat that shimmered off the ground in waves. The temperature inside the schoolhouse climbed until the air felt solid. Clara allowed the children to take their shoes off, a breach of decorum that would have horrified the school board in St. Louis. But here, it was an act of mercy. During the lunch hour, the children spilled out into the small yard to eat their meals. Clara sat at her desk, marking slates. She had a headache that pulsed behind her eyes, a rhythmic thumping in time with the heat. She heard a commotion outside, not the usual squeals of play, but the sharp, jagged sound of conflict. Clara was out the door in 2 seconds. In the dust of the yard, Thomas and 2 other boys had cornered one of the younger native boys, a small child named Sam. They weren't hitting him, but they were circling him, kicking dust onto his boots. "My PA says you people get government beef for free," Thomas was saying, his voice loud and brittle. "Says you eat better than us while we work the ground. Is that true? Sam, you got a stake in that pail?" Sam clutched his tin pail to his chest, his eyes wide. He said nothing. "Thomas!" Clara's voice cracked like a whip. The circle broke. Thomas spun around, looking guilty but defiant. "He won't talk. Miss Bennett." Thomas said, "I was just asking him a question." "You were bullying him," Clara said, marching into the center of the circle. She stood between Sam and the others. The heat seemed to radiate off her. "And you are repeating lies. The government rations." She stopped. She knew the truth about the rations. They were often rotten, maggot-ridden meat that the agency threw out like slop, but explaining that would only humiliate Sam further. "Hunger is the same in every belly. Thomas," she said instead, "if you are jealous of what is in his pail, it says more about your spirit than his food." Thomas kicked at the dirt, his face red. "It ain't fair, that's all." "Life is not fair," Clara said. "But in this schoolyard, we will be." She turned to Sam. "Are you all right?" Sam nodded, looking down. As the children dispersed, sullen and subdued, Clara felt a gaze on her. She looked toward the road. A wagon was passing a buckboard loaded with supplies. Driving it was a man in a dark suit, despite the heat. He wore a bowler hat and had a face that looked soft, as if it had never known the bite of the wind. Beside him sat a man with a shotgun. The man in the suit slowed the horses as he passed the school. He looked at Clara, then at the children, then back at Clara. He tipped his hat. It was a polite gesture, but his eyes were cold, like polished stones. "Afternoon, ma'am," he called out. His voice was smooth, carrying easily over the distance. "Keeping the peace, I see." "Trying to, sir," Clara replied, shielding her eyes. "Admirable," the man said. "Though some might say you are trying to mix oil and water. Usually it just makes a mess." He flicked the reins, and the wagon rattled on toward the agency. Clara watched him go. On the side of the wagon, in peeling paint, were the words Indian agency. That was Silas Crow. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. He had the supplies. He had the power. And he had just told her, in the politest way possible, that he was watching her fail. She turned back to the schoolhouse. The paint was peeling, the roof was leaking, and the stove was broken. She had no books, no medicine, and a town that thought she was a fool. She looked at Lila, who was sitting on the steps, tracing patterns in the dust with a stick. The girl looked up, and for a second, the mask slipped. There was a desperate hope in her eyes, a silent plea for stability in a world that kept shifting under her feet. Clara straightened her spine. The headache was still there, but the fear was gone, replaced by a stubborn, burning resolve. "All right," Clara said aloud, though no one but the wind heard her. "Let us see who breaks first. Mr. Crow, you or the school teacher?" She rang the bell, a clear, sharp sound that cut through the dusty afternoon, calling her scholars back to the only sanctuary she could offer. The lesson would continue. The chalk would turn to dust, but the words would remain. This was the borderland, where the earth was hard and the sky was big, and Clara Bennett had just dug her heels in. The wind shifted on a Tuesday night, swinging around from the south to the north, bringing with it a chill that smelled of ozone and wet slate. It was the kind of shift that made the horses in the livery stable kick at their stalls, sensing a violence in the air that had nothing to do with predators. The next morning, the supply wagon Clara had been demanding for weeks finally arrived. It rattled up to the schoolhouse door at 10 o'clock, driven by a man Clara did not recognize, a hired hand with a face obscured by a low brim and a heavy canvas coat. He did not climb down to help. He simply shoved 2 wooden crates off the back of the wagon. They hit the dry earth with a hollow, rattling sound that made Clara's stomach turn. Clara walked out, wiping chalk from her hands. "Is this all of it?" she asked. The manifest listed textbooks, slate pencils, and 20 pounds of flour. The driver spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near her boot. "That is all they gave me at the depot. Ma'am said the rest was lost in the canyon. Rock slide, maybe, or bandits. Hard to say." He flicked the reins and the wagon lurched away before she could ask for a signature. Clara knelt by the crates. She pried the lid of the first one open with the claw of a hammer. It was empty, save for a handful of dry straw and a single, heavy rock placed in the center to give it false weight. Pinned to the inside of the wood was a scrap of paper. The handwriting was jagged, scrawled in charcoal. "Teacher, don't be curious." Clara stared at the rock. It was a crude, heavy insult. They were not just stealing from the school. They were laughing at her. She looked toward the west, toward the jagged line of the canyon where the freight road wound its way from the railhead. The driver had mentioned a rock slide. If there had been an ambush or a theft, the evidence would still be there in the mud. The sky was darkening, bruising purple and charcoal gray. But Clara's anger was a heat that overrode her caution. She went to the livery stable and rented a mare named Bess for 50 cents, telling the stable master she needed to visit a family on the outskirts. She rode west, her spine stiff, the empty crate's message burning in her mind. By the time she reached the mouth of the canyon, the weather had turned. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of 10 minutes. The sky opened up, not with rain, but with hailstones the size of marbles that struck the ground with the force of gunshot. Bess whinnied and danced sideways, terrified. Clara fought the reins, her bonnet torn from her head, the ice stinging her cheeks. The trail ahead was washing out, the red dust turning into a slick, treacherous clay. Through the curtain of white ice and gray water, she saw movement in a gully to her left. A horse was down. It was a paint horse, its black and white coat smeared with mud. It was thrashing in a sinkhole of slurry that was rapidly deepening with the runoff. Beside it, a man was waist-deep in the mire, shouting commands in a language Clara did not understand. His shoulder braced against the animal's flank, trying to heave it onto solid ground. It was a man from the town. Tall Redbird. Clara did not think. She dismounted, tying Bess to a scrub oak that looked sturdy enough to hold. She slid down the embankment, the mud soaking her skirts instantly. "Grab the bridle," Taw shouted when he saw her. He did not look surprised. He looked desperate. "He is panicking. Hold his head." Clara waded in. The cold was shocking, stealing the breath from her lungs. She grabbed the horse's bridle, her fingers slipping on the wet leather. The horse's eye rolled white with terror. "Easy!" she screamed over the roar of the hail. "Easy now." Taw gritted his teeth, a vein bulging in his neck. "On 3, I push, you pull. 1, 2, 3. Clara pulled with everything she had, her boots sliding in the sludge. Taw roared, a raw sound of exertion, and shoved the animal's hindquarters. The horse lunged, hooves scrambling for purchase, and then, with a sucking sound, popped free of the mud and scrambled up the bank. Taw collapsed against the mud, clutching his left arm. "Get up!" Clara yelled, grabbing his good arm. "The water is rising!" They scrambled up the bank just as a flash flood of brown water roared through the gully where they had been standing. They stood panting, soaked to the bone, the hail turning to a freezing rain. "There is a station," Taw gasped, his voice tight with pain. "Half a mile. That way." They walked the horses, leaning into the wind. The station was a ruin, a sod dugout with half a roof and a door that hung by one hinge, but it was dry. Inside, the air was still and smelled of old earth. Taw tethered the horses in the sheltered corner of the overhang, then slumped against the wall inside the main room. He was shivering, his lips a pale shade of blue. Clara's hands were shaking, but she forced them to work. She found some dry wood in the corner remains of an old crate and used the lucifer matches she kept in her reticule. The flame sputtered, then caught. Light filled the small space, dancing on the damp walls. Clara turned to Taw. He was holding his left arm against his chest. The sleeve of his buckskin shirt was dark with blood. "You are hurt," she said. "A graze," he muttered. "From yesterday, I reopened it by lifting the horse." "Let me see." He hesitated, his dark eyes fixing on hers. He was like a wolf caught in a trap, dangerous, but exhausted. Slowly, he peeled back the sodden leather. The wound was ugly, a jagged tear along the deltoid muscle. It was not fresh, the edges were angry and red, but the fresh bleeding was profuse. "I need to clean this," Clara said. She tore a strip from her petticoat, the cleanest cloth she had. She poured a little water from her canteen onto it. She knelt beside him. He flinched when the cold cloth touched his skin, his breath hitching. "I am sorry," she whispered. She worked methodically, washing away the mud and blood. Her hands were gentle, despite the cold. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the tension in the hard muscle of his arm. He watched her face, his expression unreadable. "Why are you out here?" he asked. His voice was deep, rough like gravel. "I was looking for a thief," Clara said, tying the bandage tight. "The school supplies were stolen. I tracked the wagon." Taw went very still. "The school?" "Yes," Clara said, sitting back on her heels and pushing a wet strand of hair from her face. "I am the teacher at Dry Fork, Clara Bennett." Taw looked at her, really looked at her. The firelight flickered in his eyes, revealing a sudden, sharp depth of emotion that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He looked at her hands that were now stained with his blood and the mud of the canyon. Hands that, he realized with a jolt of terror, held a piece of chalk every day in front of his daughter. He had avoided the school. He had forbidden his sister-in-law to mention his name to the teacher. If Silas Crow knew that the daughter of Taw Redbird was in that classroom, he would find a way to use the girl to break the father. "You should not be here," Taw said abruptly. He pulled his shirt back over his shoulder, covering the bandage. "Crow has men patrolling this road." "I am not afraid of Silas Crow," Clara said. "Then you are a fool," Taw replied. He reached out to warm his hands by the fire. As he did, his sleeve rode up, revealing a leather thong around his wrist. Woven into it was a small, intricate pattern of beads, blue and white, depicting a river. Clara stared at it, "That is beautiful," she said. "The design, it looks like the drawings one of my students makes, a little girl named Lila." Ta yanked his sleeve down. The movement was so sharp it was almost violent. "It is just a trinket," he said, his voice cold. "Do not speak of things you do not understand. Miss Bennet." The rejection stung, but Clara saw the tension in his jaw. He was not angry at her. He was afraid. "But of what? We wait for the rain to stop," Ta said, staring into the fire. "Then I will guide you back to the edge of town. After that, we did not speak. You did not see me. I did not see you." "You would have died in that mud," Clara said softly. "I have died many times." Ta said, "One more would not matter." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the drumming of rain on the sod roof. It was an intimacy born of survival, fragile and heavy. Clara sat close enough to feel the warmth of his shoulder, and for the first time since coming to the frontier, she felt safe. The storm broke by dawn. Ta left her 2 miles outside of Dry Fork, disappearing into the brush without a goodbye, just a curt nod that felt more like a warning than a thank you. Clara returned to the schoolhouse, exhausted and muddy, only to find a buggy parked in front. Silas Crow was waiting for her. He was a man who looked like he was made of soft dough that had been left out to harden. He wore a suit that cost more than Clara's annual salary, and his smile did not reach his eyes. "Miss Bennet," Crow said, leaning against the porch railing. "You look like you have had a rough night, out enjoying the weather. I was checking on the delivery routes." "Mr. Crow," Clara said, climbing down from Bess. She did not brush off the mud. She wore it like armor. "Since my supplies seem to have evaporated," Crow chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "The frontier is a harsh place. Things go missing. But that is not why I'm here. I am here to discuss the curriculum." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I have heard reports. You are teaching the reservation children to read contracts. You are teaching them history." "I am teaching them to read," Clara said. "Whatever they choose to read after that is their business." Crow's smile vanished. He took a step closer, invading her space. He smelled of bay rum and stale cigars. "The budget for this school is discretionary. Miss Bennet, it comes through my office. If I decide that the funds are better spent on agricultural training, then this school closes. And if the school closes, the state requires that all ward children, that means the Indians, be transferred to the boarding school in Pennsylvania." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Pennsylvania. They would strip the children of their names, cut their hair, and beat their language out of them. It was not an education. It was an erasure. "You would not," she said. "I would," Crow whispered. "Teach them to count sacks of flour. Miss Bennet, teach them to sign their names so they can sign labor agreements. Do not teach them to think. If you do, I will shut you down. And those children will be on a train east before the snow flies." He tipped his hat, climbed into his buggy, and drove away. Clara stood on the porch, trembling. It was not just about the stolen blankets anymore. It was about survival. Crow wasn't just stealing money. He was stealing the future. If the school failed, Lila and Sam and the others would be taken. She needed proof. She needed to stop him, not just argue with him. 2 nights later, Clara went to the edge of the creek, near the place where she had seen the smoke of a campfire weeks ago. She did not know if he would be there, but she had to try. "Ta Redbird," she called out into the darkness. There was no answer, only the rustle of cottonwood leaves. "I know you can hear me," she said. "I know you hate him." A shadow detached itself from the trunk of a massive oak tree. Ta stepped into the moonlight. He looked healed, his movement fluid again, but his face was guarded. "Go home, teacher," he said. "He threatened the children," Clara said. Her voice did not shake. "He said he would send them to Pennsylvania if I did not stop teaching them. He is stealing the supplies to starve the school out." Ta stood still. The mention of Pennsylvania made his hands clench into fists at his sides. He knew what happened in those schools. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "The driver said the supplies were lost, but Crow manages the freight." Clara said, "There has to be a record, a real one, a ledger that shows where the goods actually went. I saw him carrying a black book when he came to the school. He keeps it with him or in his office." "You want to steal from the Indian agent?" Taw asked. "That is a hanging offense." "I want to borrow the truth," Clara corrected. "But I cannot get into his office alone. The deputy watches the front, but there is a back way through the warehouse. I need someone who can move without being seen, someone who knows the layout." "No," Taw said. "It is suicide." "He will take them." "Taw," Clara said, using his first name for the first time. She took a step closer. "He will take the children. The girl, Lila. She draws horses. She has a spirit like a wildfire. If they send her east, they will break her." Taw flinched as if she had struck him. He looked at Clara, his eyes searching her face for any sign of deception. He saw only fierce, desperate determination. He looked at the bandage on her arm where she had scraped herself, pulling him from the mud. She had saved him. She had touched him with hands that did not recoil. And she was fighting for Lila, even though she did not know who Lila was to him. He let out a long, ragged breath. He looked up at the moon, cursing his own weakness. "The ledger," Taw said, his voice low. "It will be in the safe at the warehouse, not his office. He moves the inventory on Thursday nights before the weekend train." Clara exhaled, her shoulders sagging with relief. "Will you help me?" "One time," Taw said, pointing a finger at her. "We got the book, we expose him, and then we are done. You never speak to me again. You leave me to the dust." "One time," Clara agreed. "Thursday," Taw said. "Midnight. Do not wear blue. Wear black." He turned and melted back into the shadows, leaving Clara alone by the creek. She touched her chest, feeling her heart hammering against her ribs. She had made a deal with a man the town called a ghost, to destroy the most powerful man in the territory. She looked back toward the town, where the lights were flickering out one by one. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of rain and danger. The ledger. It was a small thing, just paper and ink. But in Dry Fork, paper was stronger than stone, and ink could cut deeper than any knife. Clara turned and walked back toward the schoolhouse. She had a lesson to plan for tomorrow, and a heist to plan for Thursday. For the first time in her life, she felt entirely, terrifyingly awake. The following week, the curriculum at the Dry Fork Schoolhouse underwent a radical change. The poetry of Longfellow was set aside, in its place. Clara brought in a 50-pound sack of flour she had purchased with her own wages, a rusty scale borrowed from the sympathetic widow Miller, and a stack of blank paper. "Arithmetic is not just about numbers on a page," Clara told the class. She stood by the stove, the heat radiating against her back. "It is about survival. If a man sells you a sack of flour marked 50 pounds, but his scale is rigged to show heavy, you are paying for dust you did not get. Today, we learn to weigh." She called Thomas to the front. The boy looked skeptical, but he hefted the sack onto the scale. Clara taught them how to read the counterweights, how to check the balance beam for hidden magnets or filed edges. Then she moved to reading. She wrote sentences on the blackboard, not from a storybook, but from a standard land deed she had transcribed from the town hall records. The party of the first part agrees to cede all water rights to the party of the second part in perpetuity. "Perpetuity," Clara said, tapping the word with her knuckle. "It means forever. It means until the end of time. If you sign a paper with this word on it regarding your creek, your children will never drink from that water again. Do you understand?" The room was silent. Even the younger children sensed the gravity of the lesson. In the back row, Lila sat with her spine straight, her dark eyes fixed on the word perpetuity, as if it were a poisonous snake she needed to memorize in order to avoid. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, Taw met Clara behind the livery stable. He did not greet her. He simply nodded toward the south. "We are going to see Nita," he said. "She hears the whispers that the wind misses." They rode in silence, the rhythm of the horses' hooves muffled by the tall grass. Nita lived in a small cabin on the edge of the reservation boundary, a structure that was half timber and half earth, growing out of the hillside like a gnarled root. Nita was a midwife, a woman of indeterminate age with a face that looked like a topographical map of the territory full of lines, valleys, and hard history. She sat by a fire that smelled of sage and cedar, her hands busy weaving a basket from willow strips. She did not look up when they entered, but she spoke in Comanche, a rapid, fluid stream of sounds. Ta answered her, his voice softer than Clara had ever heard it. She asks why you bring a white woman to her fire. Ta translated, though he did not look at Clara. I told her you are the one who pulls horses from the mud. Nita stopped weaving. She looked at Clara with eyes that were milky with cataracts, but unsettlingly sharp. The Agent Crow, Nita said, her English heavily accented but clear. He walks with paper in his hand. He goes to the families near the Sweetwater Springs. He tells them it is a receipt for rations, but it is a paper for the land. He is stealing the water rights, Clara said, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. Before the territory becomes a state, he wants to own the flow. He uses fear, Nita said. He tells them if they do not sign, the rations stop. If the rations stop, the winter takes the old ones. So they sign. They trade forever for a sack of corn. Clara looked at Ta. His jaw was set so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. This was why he was helping her. It was not just about the school. It was about the slow, bureaucratic strangulation of his people. As they prepared to leave, Clara noticed a small wooden carving on Nita's mantle. It was a horse, simple but fluid, captured in mid-gallop. The style was strikingly similar to the drawings Lila made on her slate. Who made this? Clara asked, touching the wood gently. Nita glanced at the carving, then at Ta. The silence that followed was heavy. Ta turned away, adjusting the cinch on his saddle with unnecessary force. A child, Nita said finally. A child with a heavy heart. On the ride back, Clara watched Ta's silhouette against the stars. That carving, she said. The style looks like the drawings my student Lila makes, and the bracelet you wear the river pattern. She draws that too. Ta stiffened in the saddle. Many children draw horses, Clara, and the river is the life of the plains. It belongs to everyone's eyes. He refused to say more, kicking his horse into a canter that left Clara trailing in the dust, wondering at the walls he kept rebuilding between them. The next day, Clara went to the general store to buy beans. The school cupboard was bare, and she had noticed Sam and 2 other students sharing a single piece of hardtack for lunch. She could not teach hungry children. As she hefted a 10-pound sack of pinto beans onto the counter, the door opened with a jingle of bells that sounded too cheerful for the tension in the room. Lydia Bell swept in. She owned the Silver Star Saloon, a woman of 40 who wore crimson silk at 10 in the morning and painted her lips a shade of red that scandalized the church wives. She was beautiful in a sharp, dangerous way, like a glass shard catching the light. Well, if it is not the little school teacher, Lydia drawled, leaning against the counter. She smelled of violets and cheap whiskey. Buying beans, planning a feast, or just admitting that a teacher's salary does not buy steak. I am feeding my students, Miss Bell, Clara said, counting out coins. Something the town council seems to have forgotten to do. Lydia laughed, a low, throaty sound. She looked past Clara, her eyes lighting up with a predatory gleam. Clara turned. Ta was outside, repairing a loose board on the boardwalk. He was kneeling, his back to them, unaware or pretending to be unaware of their presence. He is a fine thing to look at, is he not? Lydia whispered, stepping close to Clara. I used to keep him warm. Years ago, when he first came back from the army, broken and bleeding. I put him back together. Clara felt a flush of heat rise up her neck. It was jealousy, sharp and irrational. He is helping repair the schoolhouse, Clara said stiffly. Is that what he is doing? Lydia smirked. Honey, men like Tall Redbird do not fix things. They survive things. Do not think you can tame a wolf just because you fed it a biscuit. He will leave you. He always leaves. Lydia sashayed out the door, pausing to place a hand on Taw's shoulder as she passed. Clara watched Taw freeze. He did not look up, did not speak. He waited until Lydia removed her hand and walked away before he resumed hammering. The nail went into the wood with a single, violent strike. Saturday brought a windstorm that tore 3 shingles from the schoolhouse roof and ripped the main door from its top hinge. Sunday morning, Clara found Taw already there. He had brought his own tools, a saw, a hammer, and a bag of nails. He was on the roof, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat. Clara did not ask him to come. He had simply appeared, as inevitable as the sunrise. Clara abandoned her lesson planning and found a ladder. She climbed up, handing him shingles she had scavenged from the woodpile. They worked in a rhythm that required no words. Taw would hold out a hand. Clara would place a nail in it. He would position the shingle. She would hold it steady against the wind while he drove the nail home. There was an intimacy in the labor that unsettled Clara more than any conversation. It was the intimacy of shared purpose. Up here, on the roof, with the vast sky pressing down on them, they were a team. "You use a hammer well for a teacher," Taw commented, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead with his forearm. "My father was a carpenter before he was a drunk," Clara said, the admission slipping out before she could check it. "I learned to hold the wood steady so he would not hit his thumb." Taw looked at her, his dark eyes softening. "My father was a chief," he said quietly. "He learned to read the wind so we would not starve. We are both children of men who tried to hold on to things that were slipping away." He reached out to take a shingle from her, and his fingers brushed hers. The contact was electric, a sudden spark that made both of them pull back slightly. "Clara," he said. It was the second time he had used her name. It sounded heavy on his tongue, like a confession. "We should finish the roof," Clara said, her voice breathless. "It looks like rain." They finished the work as the sun went high. Afterward, Clara fired up the stove inside. She had soaked the beans overnight, and now the smell of savory broth, onions, and salt pork filled the small room. It was not just for the students anymore. She ladled a bowl for Taw, who sat on one of the small benches, his knees drawn up, looking too large for the room. "It is good," he said after the first spoonful. "It is simple." Clara replied, "Simple is rare." Taw said, "Simple is safe." The door creaked open. It was Deputy Owen Hart. He looked nervous, twisting his hat in his hands. "Afternoon. Miss Bennett, Taw." Owen nodded to the man in the corner, showing no surprise at his presence. "Just wanted to let you know, Crow is moving inventory at the warehouse tonight. Extra guards, 2 men from the rail company." "Why tell us this?" "Owen," Clara asked. Owen looked at his boots. "My sister's boy is in your class. Little Davy. He came home yesterday reading a contract, told his PA that the grain merchant was cheating them on the weight. My brother-in-law checked. The boy was right. Saved him $4. Owen put his hat back on. "Crow is a bad man, Miss Bennett, but he is the law out here. Be careful." He left, the door latch clicking softly into the new catch Taw had installed. "Tonight," Taw said, staring into his empty bowl. "If there are extra guards, he is moving something valuable, or something damning." "We're going tonight," Clara confirmed. The fear was there, cold and sharp, but underneath it was something else. She looked at Taw, at the way his hand rested on the table. Strong and scarred. She was afraid of getting caught. Yes, but she was more afraid of the moment when this mission ended. He would retreat back to the creek, leaving her alone in the silence. Taw felt her gaze. He was terrified, not of the guns or the prison cell, but of the feeling expanding in his chest. He looked at Clara and saw a light he had thought was extinguished from the world. If he stayed close to her, he would burn. But if he walked away, he would freeze. And worse, if Crow found out about Lila. He stood up abruptly. "I will meet you at the culvert at 10 o'clock. That night, the moon was obscured by drifting clouds. They moved like shadows along the perimeter of the agency warehouse. Tom moved with a silence that seemed supernatural. Clara tried to mimic him, placing her feet carefully to avoid snapping dry twigs. They reached the rear of the building, pressing themselves against the rough wood siding. Inside, they could hear voices. "Load the crates marked agricultural tools first." A voice boomed. It was Crow. "The whiskey is in the back." "Whiskey," Clara breathed. "It is illegal to sell whiskey on the reservation." "It is profitable," Taw whispered back, his mouth close to her ear. A guard walked past the corner of the building, a lantern swinging in his hand. Taw reacted instantly. He grabbed Clara and pulled her down behind a stack of empty barrels. He covered her body with his, pressing her into the dirt. Clara could feel the beat of his heart against her back, steady and slow. She could smell the scent of him: wood smoke, leather, and rain. The guard paused, the lantern light sweeping over the barrels. "Hear something," the guard muttered. "Wind," another voice answered. "Just the wind." The footsteps faded. Taw did not move immediately. He held her there, shielded, for a long moment. When he finally pulled back, the air between them was charged, heavy with the things they could not say. "We cannot get to the safe tonight," Taw whispered. "Too many eyes, but we know the schedule now. Thursday is the shipment. Wednesday is when he cooks the books." They retreated, slipping back into the darkness of the prairie. The next morning, Clara was sweeping the classroom. Her nerves were frayed, her hands trembling slightly. The near miss at the warehouse had made the danger real. She moved the benches to sweep underneath them. Under the desk where Lila usually sat, she found a piece of paper. It was a drawing, charcoal on slate paper. It depicted a man standing near a tree, his back turned, looking out over a prairie. The figure was solitary, the shoulders slumped in a way that suggested a great weight, but it was the detail of the hands that stopped Clara's breath. The man was wearing a bracelet with a river pattern. At the bottom of the page, in letters that were shaky but determined, Lila had written a single sentence: "My father is a quiet man." There was no name, just the statement. Clara stared at the drawing. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The bracelet, the horse carvings, the way Taw stayed at the edge of the town, watching, the way Lila froze when people spoke of Comanches. Taw was not just a lonely scout. He was a father who had erased himself to protect his child. Clara sank onto the bench, the drawing trembling in her hand. She looked at the stove, where the bean pot sat cold. She looked at the door Taw had fixed. "Oh, Taw," she whispered to the empty room. "You fool. You beautiful, stubborn fool." She did not know that outside, watching through the crack in the shutters, a pair of eyes had seen her find the drawing. But it was not Taw. It was Silas Crow's foreman, chewing on a toothpick, a slow smile spreading across his face. He turned his horse and rode quietly toward the agency. The teacher had found a secret, and secrets, in Dry Fork, were the most valuable currency of all. The annual Dry Fork Harvest Festival was the sort of event that the town used to pretend it was civilized. Lanterns were strung between the livery stable and the general store, casting a golden, forgiving glow over the rutted street. A fiddle player had been brought in from Oklahoma City, and the air smelled of roasted corn, cheap perfume, and the desperate optimism of people who had survived another winter. Silas Crow would be there. It was his stage. He would stand on the platform, shake hands, kiss babies, and accept the town's gratitude for the new irrigation pumps paid for, Clara suspected, with money skimmed from the school's heating budget. To get the ledger, Clara needed to get into the back room of the town hall where Crow had set up his temporary headquarters for the evening. But the hall was guarded by the social expectations of the town as much as by men with guns. A single woman lurking near the offices would be stopped, questioned, and gossiped about before she reached the doorknob. She needed a distraction, or better yet, a shield. She found tall Redbird by the creek, where the cottonwoods were turning the color of old gold. He was sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic shh sound blending with the wind. He looked up as she approached. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she'd wrung her hands not out of weakness, but out of a surplus of energy she did not know how to spend. "The festival is tonight," Clara said without preamble. "Crow will be there. The ledger will be in the traveling trunk he keeps in the back office. He never lets it out of his sight, even for a party." Taw stopped sharpening. He tested the blade against his thumb. "And you plan to walk in and take it? I plan to be in the room when he opens it," Clara said. "But I cannot get close to the hall alone. His men are watching me. They know my face. They know I am trouble. If I walk in alone, I am a target. If I walk in with someone, I am just a woman at a dance." Taw stood up. He sheathed the knife. He looked toward the town, where the faint sound of the fiddle was already drifting on the breeze. He knew what she was asking, and he knew the cost. For a Comanche man to walk into that gathering was to invite every stare, every insult, and every simmering hatred the town possessed. But he needed Crow to fall. For the land. For the water. And, though he would not say it aloud, for the future of a child he watched only from the shadows. He looked at Clara. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes. She was terrified, he realized, but she was standing there anyway. He took a step closer. The wind blew a strand of hair across her face, and he fought the urge to reach out and brush it away. "I need to walk through that crowd," Taw said, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding together. "But if I go alone, the deputy will stop me at the perimeter. They will see a threat, a savage." He paused, a strange, crooked smile touching his lips. It was a lonely smile, one that had not been used in years. It did not reach his eyes, which remained watchful. "Can you be my date for one day?" he asked. The question hung in the air, absurd and heartbreaking. He thought it was a transaction. He thought he was asking for a tactical alliance, a way to slip past the guards using her respectability as a cloak. He did not know that she had seen the drawing. He did not know that she knew exactly whose heart beat beneath that buckskin shirt. Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. She swallowed it down. "One day," she agreed. "But I have conditions. No violence unless it is to save a life. We walk in, we play the part, I get the book, and we leave." Taw nodded. "No violence," he promised. But as he looked at her, his dark eyes hardened with a silent vow that contradicted his words. "I will not start the fight," his eyes said, "but I will finish it. Meet me at the edge of the square at 7 o'clock, Clara said, "and Taw, wear a coat." At 7 o'clock, the harvest festival was in full swing. The square was packed with bodies moving in a swirl of calico and denim. The music was loud, a frantic reel that made the floorboards of the platform shake. When Taw and Clara stepped into the light of the lanterns, the music did not stop, but the conversation nearest to them died instantly. The silence rippled outward like a wave, until half the square was turning to look. Clara wore her Sunday dress, a simple navy blue cotton with a white lace collar. But it was Taw who held the room. He wore a black frock coat that was slightly too tight across the shoulders, likely bartered from a trader. His hair was pulled back severely, and his boots were polished. He looked like a king in exile, or perhaps a wolf trying to pass as a sheepdog. He offered Clara his arm. He did not look at the ground. He looked straight ahead, his expression carved from granite. Clara took his arm. His muscles were rigid beneath the cloth. "Head high," she whispered. "Let them look." "They are looking at you," Taw murmured. "They are wondering why the schoolteacher is walking with the enemy." "Let them wonder," Clara said. They moved through the crowd. The crowd parted, creating a wide berth around them. Clara heard the whispers sharp, hissing sounds like steam escaping a valve. "Is that the Redbird fellow? With Miss Bennett, has she lost her mind? My husband says he killed 3 men in the Canyon Wars." Lydia Bell appeared from the throng near the punch bowl. She was wearing a dress of crimson taffeta that rustled aggressively when she moved. She held a glass of punch as if it were a weapon. Well, Lydia drawled, blocking their path. Her eyes raked over Taw, then settled on Clara with amused contempt. I must say, Miss Bennet, you have a flair for the dramatic. Bringing a pet to the party that is bold, even for you." Tall's arm tightened under Clara's hand, but he did not speak. He kept his eyes fixed on a point above Lydia's head. Clara smiled. It was a tight, polite smile that showed no teeth. "Mr. Redbird is not a pet. Lydia, he is a citizen of this territory, and I believe he dances better than half the men here who are stepping on their wives' toes." Lydia's smile faltered. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You are playing a dangerous game, schoolteacher. You think you are making a statement, but you are just making yourself a target. When the music stops, who do you think will protect you, him?" She gestured to Taw with her glass. "He cannot even protect himself." "Excuse us," Clara said coolly. She steered Taw around the woman. They reached the edge of the dance floor, on the raised platform at the far end of the hall. Silas Crow was holding court. He was laughing, a cigar clamped between his teeth, slapping men on the back. Behind him was the door to the town clerk's office, his temporary sanctum. "The door is guarded," Taw noted softly. "2 men, shotguns." "I will handle the guards," Clara said. "You keep the crowd's attention. Ask me to dance." Taw looked at her, startled. "I do not dance the waltz. Clara, then we will improvise," she said. "Just hold me and turn in a circle. Make them stare at us so they do not look at the door." Taw hesitated, then placed his hand on her waist. It was a tentative touch, surprisingly gentle. He pulled her into the flow of the dancers. He was stiff at first, moving with the jerky caution of a man walking on ice, but he had a natural grace. They turned, the world spinning into a blur of light and color. For a moment, just a fleeting heartbeat, the mission faded. Clara looked up at him, and he looked down. The hostility of the town fell away. There was only the warmth of his hand, the scent of soap and cedar, and the terrifying realization that she did not want to let go. "Now," she whispered. She spun away from him, pretending to stumble slightly, and slipped into the shadow of a large decorative hay bale near the platform stairs. Taw immediately turned, creating a visual barrier with his broad back, blocking the line of sight from the floor. Clara moved fast. The guards were watching the dancers, distracted by the spectacle of the Comanche and the teacher. She slipped past them while they were nudging each other and laughing at Taw. The office door was unlocked. Crow's arrogance was his padlock. He believed no one would dare. Clara slipped inside and closed the door softly. The room was dim, lit only by the moonlight filtering through a high window. The traveling trunk sat on the desk, open. She moved to it, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. There it was, the black ledger. She opened it. Her eyes scanned the columns: flour, blankets, whiskey, ammunition. The dates matched the stolen shipments. The destinations were listed not as schools, but as private buyers in Texas and Mexico. "Got you?" she breathed. She reached for the book to tuck it into her sash. "I would not do that if I were you." The voice came from the corner of the room. A match flared, illuminating the heavy, doughy face of Silas Crow. He had been sitting in the armchair in the dark, waiting. Clara froze. "Did you think I was deaf? Miss Bennet?" Crow stood up, shaking out the match. "Or just stupid. I think you are a thief, Mr. Crow," Clara said, her voice trembling but loud. "And now I have the proof. Proof is only useful if you live to show it to a judge," Crow said. He moved with surprising speed for a heavy man. He lunged across the desk and grabbed her wrist. His grip was wet and crushing. "Let go of me," Clara cried out, twisting her arm. "You ruin everything," Crow hissed, his face inches from hers. The charm was gone, replaced by a naked, ugly rage. "I offered you a way out. I told you to teach them to be laborers. But no, you had to be a savior. And now look at you, sneaking around in the dark with a savage." He twisted her arm behind her back. Clara cried out in pain. "I'm going to have you arrested," Crow whispered. "For trespassing, for attempted theft, And maybe, just maybe, you will resist arrest." The door crashed open. It did not swing. It exploded inward, the latch splintering under the force of a kick. Tall Redbird stood in the frame. He did not have a weapon drawn, but his stance was lethal. His chest was heaving, his eyes black holes of fury. He had heard her cry. "Take your hands off her," Ta said. The volume was low, but the menace filled the room, sucking the oxygen out of the air. Crow laughed, though he loosened his grip slightly. He dragged Clara around to use her as a shield. "Look at this," Crow sneered. "The watchdog comes running. Tell me, Redbird, does she pay you in whiskey or in something sweeter?" Ta took a step forward. "I said, let her go." "Or what?" Crow challenged. "You will strike a federal agent in front of the whole town. Do it, please. Give me the excuse to hang you right here on the celebratory arch." He tightened his grip on Clara's hair, yanking her head back. "You are nothing. Redbird, you are a relic. You live in the dirt. You have no land. You have no name. Do you think you still have the right to be a man? Do you think you still have the right to be a father?" The word hung in the air. "Father." Ta went rigid. The taunt struck the deepest wound he carried. Suddenly, there was a commotion in the hallway. Small footsteps running, dodging past the guards who were now shouting, "Teacher, teacher!" A small figure burst into the office, ducking under Ta's arm. It was Lila. She was wearing her best dress, a faded yellow calico, and her braids were flying. She had seen the deputy heading for the back room, heard the crash, and terror had overcome her training. She stopped in the center of the room, looking from Crow to Clara. "Leave her alone," Lila screamed, her small voice shrill with panic. Then she saw the man standing in the doorway, the man who had trained himself to be a ghost, the man she was forbidden to acknowledge in daylight. The fear vanished, replaced by an instinct older than any law. Lila turned and threw her arms around Ta's waist, burying her face in his coat. "Papa," she sobbed. "Papa, make him stop." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence louder than the music outside, louder than the wind. Ta froze. His hands, which had been curled into fists ready to kill, hovered in the air. He looked down at the top of the small head pressed against him. His breath stopped. "Papa," she had said it, in front of Crow, in front of the guards who were now crowding the doorway, in front of Clara. He looked up slowly, his eyes wide with shock and a terrible, dawning horror. He looked at Clara. Clara was leaning against the desk, nursing her bruised wrist. She was not looking at Crow. She was looking at him. Her eyes were filled with tears, but not of surprise. They were filled with a profound, aching sorrow for him. She knew. Ta realized. She already knew. But he had not known that she was the teacher. The woman he had been helping, the woman he had just danced with. She was the one shaping his daughter's mind. The one Lila drew pictures for. "Lila," Ta whispered, the name breaking from his throat like a shard of glass. He touched her hair, his hand trembling. Crow began to laugh. It was a dry, clapping sound. "Well," Crow said, releasing Clara and stepping back, smoothing his suit jacket. "Isn't this touching the family reunion? I had my suspicions. Of course, the eyes are the same." He looked at the crowd gathering in the hallway. The mayor, the preacher, the shopkeepers. They were staring, mouths agape. The secret was out. The ghost had a tether. Crow saw his opportunity. He saw the ledger on the desk where Clara had dropped it. He saw the way the townspeople were looking at Ta not with sympathy, but with the renewed suspicion of a deception revealed. Crow raised his voice, pitching it to the back of the room. "Arrest them." Crow shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Clara and Ta. "Arrest them both!" The music outside stopped. The crowd pressed in. "This woman," Crow bellowed, "has been conspiring with this man to defraud the school district. She seduced him to gain access to the town funds. Look at them. He is the father of one of her students, and they have been plotting this together." "That is a lie," Clara shouted, stepping forward. "He is stealing the money. The ledger is right here." The ledger she was trying to steal, Crow countered smoothly. To alter the records, to cover her own embezzlement. Why else would she be here in the dark with a Comanche? Why else would she hide the fact that she is teaching his child? He turned to the crowd. She is not just a bad teacher. She is a traitor. She is bringing the enemy into your homes, into your pockets. The mood of the room shifted. It turned ugly. The fear that Clara had fought so hard to dispel came rushing back, fed by Crow's lies. "Is it true?" a woman called out. "Is he the girl's father?" Clara looked at Taw. He was standing like a statue, his arm now wrapped protectively around Lila, shielding her face from the crowd. He looked at Clara, and in his eyes, she saw the walls slamming back up, the trust they had built on the roof, in the canyon, in the dance. It was shattering under the weight of the exposure. He looked betrayed. He thought she had used the child to get to him. He thought she had played him. "Taw," Clara whispered, stepping toward him. "I didn't." "Do not," Taw said. His voice was cold, dead. "Do not come near her." He backed away, pulling Lila with him, his eyes darting to the window, the door, calculating an escape that was no longer possible. Deputy Crow ordered, "Take them into custody. The woman for theft, the man for disturbing the peace, and turn the girl over to the agency custody. She is a ward of the state now. Clearly, her father is unfit." "No!" Clara screamed. She lunged for the ledger, desperate to show them the truth. But Crow was faster. He snatched the book and slammed it shut. "Evidence," Crow said with a smirk. "I will keep this safe until the trial." Deputy Hart stepped forward, his face pale and conflicted. "Miss Bennett, Taw, you have to come with me. Please, don't make it a fight." Taw looked at the deputy, then at Crow, then at the terrified face of his daughter. If he fought, they would kill him, and Lila would be alone with Crow. He slowly raised his hands, surrendering. But his eyes remained fixed on Clara, burning with a mixture of love and betrayal that cut deeper than any knife. "I trusted you," he mouthed. Clara stood alone in the center of the room as the townspeople jeered. She had the truth, but she had lost the trust. And as they dragged Taw away, she realized that the price of the truth might be everything they had both tried to save. Outside, the wind began to howl, kicking up dust that swirled around the lanterns, choking the light. The dance was over. The war had begun. The iron door of the jail cell slammed shut with a sound that felt like the end of the world. The echo rang in the small, stone room, bouncing off the damp walls and settling into the bones of the two prisoners. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. Outside, the wind had picked up, turning into a low, mournful howl that rattled the window bars. Inside, the air was thick with tension and the smell of unwashed bodies and despair. Tall Redbird sat on the narrow cot, his head in his hands. He had not spoken since they dragged him in. He was a statue of contained rage, his muscles coiled so tight that Clara feared he might snap the handcuffs that bound his wrists. Clara stood by the bars, gripping the cold iron until her knuckles turned white. She could still hear Silas Crow's voice, oily and triumphant, ordering the deputy to prepare the transfer papers. "Pennsylvania," Taw whispered. The word was barely audible, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. "He is sending her on the morning train." "He cannot," Clara said, though her voice lacked the certainty she tried to project. "He needs a judge to sign the order." "He is the law here," Taw said. He looked up, and his eyes were terrifying. They were not the eyes of the man who had helped her fix the roof. They were the eyes of a warrior who had nothing left to lose. "I will kill him. When they open this door, I will take the gun from the deputy, and I will put a bullet in Crow's heart." "No," Clara said sharply. She turned from the bars and knelt in front of him, heedless of the dirt on the floor. "Listen to me. Taw, look at me." He refused to meet her gaze. He was looking through the wall, envisioning the violence to come. "If you kill him, you prove him right," Clara said, forcing her voice to be steady. "You become the savage he told the town you are. They will hang you. And Lila, she will be the daughter of a murderer. She will be sent away, and she will carry that shame for the rest of her life." Taw's jaw worked. "She is gone anyway." "Clara, I failed her. You only fail if you stop fighting the right way, Clara insisted. She reached out and placed her hands over his clenched fists. If you shoot, he wins. If you prove his guilt, Lila wins. She stays with us. Taw looked at her then. The anger in his eyes cracked, revealing a vast, raw grief. Us, yes, Clara said firmly. Us. The heavy door to the outer office creaked open. Deputy Owen Hart stepped into the cell block. He looked pale, his hat pulled low, a ring of keys in his hand. He did not look like a man doing his duty. He looked like a man wrestling with his soul. Deputy, Clara said softly. Owen stopped in front of the cell. He did not look at them. He looked at the keys. Crow is at the telegraph office, Owen said to the floor. He is wiring the district marshal to come for you two. Says you are agitators. Says you incite violence. And the girl? Taw asked, his voice rasping. She is locked in the agency infirmary room. Owen said, Guard on the door. Train leaves at 8. Owen took a deep breath. He looked up, and his eyes were wet. My sister's boy. He told me about the beans, Miss Bennett, how you fed them when the agency cut the rations. And I remember the winter of '86. I remember how many we buried because the blankets never came. He put the key in the lock. The click was the loudest sound in the universe. I am going to turn my back, Owen said, swinging the door open. I am going to go check the perimeter. If the cell is empty when I come back, well, I suppose the lock was faulty. Owen, Clara said, we need the ledger. He took it back to the warehouse? Not the warehouse. Owen corrected. The old grain annex. He moved everything there an hour ago. He is planning to burn the main warehouse tonight, collect the insurance and destroy the evidence of the empty crates all at once. Clara and Taw exchanged a look. Fire. Go, Owen whispered. And for God's sake, make it count. The storm hit as they exited the back alley of the jail. It was not raining, not yet. It was a dry, furious wind that swept down from the panhandle, picking up the red earth and turning the air into a blinding, stinging fog. Visibility dropped to 10 feet. Tumbleweeds flew down the main street like fleeing animals. The weather is with us, Taw shouted over the roar of the wind. The guards will be blind. They moved through the shadows. 2 ghosts in the dust. Clara held her skirts, her eyes stinging, following the dark shape of Taw's back. He moved with a terrifying purpose now. He was no longer the outcast. He was the hunter. The grain annex was a wooden structure set apart from the main agency buildings, near the edge of the schoolyard. Through the swirling dust, Clara could see the orange flicker of torches. Crow was there, and he was not alone. They crouched behind a water trough. Clara wiped the grit from her eyes. 2 men were dousing the side of the main warehouse with kerosene. Crow stood by the annex door, holding a lantern, shouting orders that were snatched away by the wind. He is burning it now, Clara gasped. The wind, it is blowing toward the school. Taw looked at the wind direction. She was right. If the warehouse went up, the sparks would carry straight to the dried timber of the schoolhouse roof. The ledger is in the annex, Taw said. I will draw them off. You get the book. No, Clara said, gripping his arm. We do it together. We are a team. Remember? Before Taw could argue, a crack of thunder shook the ground, followed instantly by a jagged bolt of lightning that illuminated the scene in stark, blue-white relief. In that flash, one of Crow's men saw them. Hey, the man shouted, raising his shotgun. The time for planning was over. Taw moved. He did not run. He flowed. He closed the distance between himself and the gunman before the man could shoulder his weapon. Taw struck him a chop to the wrist that sent the gun flying, followed by a shoulder check that knocked the man into the dirt. Get the book, Taw roared at Clara. Clara scrambled toward the open door of the annex. Crow turned, his eyes wide. He saw Taw rising from the dust like a demon. Panic seized the agent. He threw the lantern at Taw. Taw rolled. The lantern shattered against the wall of the annex. The kerosene inside ignited instantly. Whoosh! A sheet of flame raced up the dried wood. eager and hungry. "Fire!" someone screamed. Clara was inside the annex. It was filled with crates, the real crates, blankets, sacks of flour, boxes of medicine. And there, on a barrel near the door, was the black ledger. She grabbed it. The smoke was already curling under the roof. The fire was spreading with terrifying speed, fed by the gale force wind. Outside, chaos had erupted. Ta was fighting two men. He did not use a knife. He used his hands, his feet, and the environment. He ducked a swinging rifle butt and swept the man's legs. He was fighting to disable, not to kill, remembering Clara's promise. But every blow he took a fist to the jaw, a boot to the ribs, slowed him down. Clara burst out of the annex, clutching the ledger to her chest. "Ta school!" she screamed. The wind had caught the embers from the burning annex and flung them across the yard. The roof of the schoolhouse, the roof they had fixed together, was smoking. A patch of shingles caught fire, glowing like an angry eye in the darkness. The alarm bell began to ring. Someone in town had seen the flames. "Go!" Ta shouted, throwing one of the guards into a stack of hay bales. "Save the school, I will handle Crow." Clara ran. She ran toward the schoolhouse, the heart of her world. The fire was licking at the eaves. She needed water. She needed help. But as she reached the pump in the schoolyard, she stopped. The bell was ringing, and the town was coming. Men with buckets, women with shawls over their heads, running from the main street, and stepping out of the shadows of the burning annex, holding a Colt revolver, was Silas Crow. He was disheveled, soot-stained, and desperate. He saw Clara. He saw the book in her arms. "Give it to me!" he screamed, leveling the gun at her. Ta emerged from the smoke behind Crow. He was bleeding from a cut above his eye, limping slightly. He saw the gun pointed at Clara. He did not hesitate. He threw himself at Crow. The gun went off. Bang! The sound was swallowed by the wind, but Clara felt the bullet tug at her skirt. Ta slammed into Crow, and both men went down in the dust. They rolled, grappling for the weapon. The townspeople poured into the yard. They froze, witnessing the scene: the burning warehouse, the smoking school, the teacher clutching a black book, and the Indian agent fighting the Comanche in the dirt. "Stop it!" Clara screamed. Her voice was raw, powered by a desperation that silenced the wind. "Stop it right now!" Ta wrenched the gun from Crow's hand and tossed it away. He pinned Crow to the ground, his forearm against the agent's throat. He raised his fist to strike, to finish it, to end the threat forever. "Ta, no!" Clara cried out. Ta froze. His fist hovered in the air. He looked up. The firelight illuminated the circle of faces surrounding them. The ranch hands, the shopkeepers, the mothers, Thomas's father, they were all watching. Clara stepped forward. She did not run from the fire. She stood before it, the flames framing her like a vengeful angel. She held the ledger up high. "Do not look at the fight," Clara shouted. "Look at this." She opened the book. The wind tore at the pages, but she held them fast. October 12th, she read, her voice ringing out. 50 wool blankets, allocated for the Dry Fork School, marked as delivered. But where are they? She pointed to the burning annex. They are in there burning because he stole them. Crow struggled beneath Ta, gasping for air. She lies. She is crazy. November 4th, Clara continued, ignoring him. 200 pounds of flour, marked as lost in transit, found in the possession of the Encino Mining Company, sold for cash. She walked toward the crowd, shoving the book toward Thomas's father. Read it, read where your tax money went. It did not go to the savages. It went to his pocket. The man took the book. He squinted at the handwriting in the flickering light. His face went hard. He looked at Crow. It is here, the man said, his voice low but carrying. It is all here, every dollar. The mood of the crowd shifted instantly. It was a physical thing, a turning of the tide. They looked at Crow not as an authority, but as a parasite. Crow sensed it. He surged up, bucking Ta off with a desperate force. He scrambled to his feet, panting, wild-eyed. You listen to me, Crow shrieked. I am the federal government. I am the law. You cannot touch me. He looked for an escape, He saw the infirmary wagon that had pulled up near the edge of the chaos. The guard had brought Lila out, intending to move her away from the fire. Crow lunged. Before anyone could react, he grabbed Lila, hauling the child against his chest. He pulled a second, smaller pistol from his boot and pressed it to her temple. "Back off!" Crow screamed. "Back off or the girl dies!" The crowd gasped and surged back. Lila did not scream. She became rigid, her eyes locking onto her father. Taw stood up slowly. Blood was running down his face, mixing with the soot. He held his hands out, palms open. "Let her go, Silas," Taw said. His voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. "Get me a horse," Crow demanded. "I am leaving, and I am taking her as insurance." "Look around you," Taw said, taking a slow step forward. "Stay back." Crow cocked the hammer. "Look at them," Taw commanded, his voice rising. "Look at the town. They are all watching you. Every man, every woman. They know what you are now. If you hurt her, there is no hole in this earth deep enough for you to hide in." Crow's eyes darted around the circle. He saw no fear in the faces of the townspeople anymore. He saw hate. He saw 100 witnesses who would hunt him down. "You are done," Taw said, taking another step. "It is over. Put the gun down, and maybe you'll live to see a jail cell." Crow's hand trembled. The power had evaporated. He was just a thief in a suit, holding a child who was braver than he was. Crow stammered. "Mr. Crow." The voice came from the side. It was Lydia Bell. She stepped out of the crowd, her crimson dress stained with ash. She held a piece of paper in her hand. "You forgot something," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "When you sold the water rights to the cattle syndicate last month, you stamped the receipt with your personal seal, the one you keep in your vest pocket." She held up the paper. "I found it in your coat when you were drunk at my saloon. I kept it, just for a rainy day." She walked up to the deputy, Owen Hart, and handed him the paper. "Federal fraud. Owen, clear as day." Crow stared at her. "Lydia, You promised me the world, Silas," Lydia said, lighting a cigarette. "But you are just a cheap crook who hurts children." The fight went out of Silas Crow. He looked at the gun in his hand, then at the wall of people, then at Taw. He realized that pulling the trigger would be his own execution. He lowered the gun. Instantly, Taw was there. He pulled Lila from Crow's grasp, swinging her behind him. Deputy Hart stepped forward and pistol-whipped Crow across the jaw. It was a solid, meaty sound. Crow crumpled to the dust, unconscious. "It is over," Owen said, holstering his weapon. Taw dropped to his knees, clutching Lila. She buried her face in his neck, sobbing finally. He held her with a ferocity that shook his frame, his blood smearing on her yellow dress, but he did not care. "I am here," he whispered into her hair. "Papa is here." Clara stood a few feet away. The adrenaline crashed. The smoke she had inhaled suddenly seized her lungs. She doubled over, coughing violently, her vision graying out. "Clara!" Taw's voice. He was there, his arm around her waist, holding her up. Lila was clinging to his other side. "The school!" Clara gasped, pointing. "The fire!" "We have it, Miss Bennett." Thomas's father shouted. The town was moving. A bucket brigade had already formed. Men were climbing onto the roof of the schoolhouse, throwing water, beating the flames with wet sacks. The animosity toward the teacher was gone, replaced by the primal instinct to save the community. Clara watched as the flames on the roof hissed and died. The wood was blackened, scarred, and ugly. But the structure stood. The walls held. She looked at Taw. He was battered, bleeding, and exhausted, but he was standing in the center of the town, holding his daughter. And no one was looking at him with hatred. They were looking at him with a grudging, silent respect. He looked back at her. The barrier was gone. "You saved us," Taw said softly. "We saved us," Clara corrected, before the darkness took the edges of her vision and she allowed herself to lean against him, letting the strength of the Comanche warrior hold her up as the storm finally broke into a heavy, cleansing rain. The rain that had extinguished the fire had turned the red dust of the schoolyard into a thick, clinging clay. But for the first time in months, the mud did not feel like a trap. It felt like the earth was knitting itself back together. 3 days after the fire, the Dry Fork School was back in session, though it looked nothing like a school. The roof of the schoolhouse was a blackened skeleton, open to the sky. The smell of wet char still hung heavy in the air. Classes were now held in the livery stable's hayloft, a space donated by the smith who had once refused to look Taw in the eye. The air smelled of alfalfa and old leather bridles. There were no desks. The children sat on bales of hay arranged in a semicircle. Clara stood at the front, wearing a gray work dress that was stained at the hem with soot she could not wash out. There was no blackboard. It had shattered in the heat. In its place, Clara had propped up a large, flat piece of siding salvaged from the burned annex. The wood was scorched black on one side. She held a piece of chalk, its white dust coating her fingers. "The history of a place," Clara said, her voice competing with the soft stamping of horses in the stalls below, "is not written in the buildings that stand, it is written in the buildings we rebuild." She turned to the charred wood and wrote a single word in large, block letters: resilience. The white chalk stood out stark and bright against the black, burnt surface. It was a defiant contrast. "Can anyone tell me what this word means?" Clara asked. Thomas, the boy who had once mocked the reservation children, raised his hand. His face was smudged with dirt from helping his father clear debris all morning. "It means being tough. Miss Bennett, like iron. Iron is strong," Clara corrected gently. "But iron breaks if you hit it hard enough. Resilience is more like the grass on the prairie. The fire burns it, the wind flattens it, but it has deep roots. It always comes back." She looked to the back of the makeshift room. Lila was there. She was sitting on a bale of hay next to Taw, who had been allowed to stay in the loft to rest. Lila was not hiding in the corner anymore. She was sitting upright, holding her slate, sketching the pattern of the rafters. Taw was leaning against a support beam, his left leg extended stiffly, wrapped in clean bandages. He was watching Clara. His face, usually a mask of vigilance, was softened by a mixture of exhaustion and a quiet, bewildered awe. He had expected to be run out of town or hanged. Instead, he was sitting in a warm barn, listening to a woman teach children about how to survive a fire. Later that afternoon, after the children had been dismissed to help their families, the loft grew quiet. The late autumn sun filtered through the gaps in the barn walls, slicing the dusty air with beams of gold. Clara climbed the ladder with a kettle of tea and a fresh basin of water. She set them down on a crate beside Taw. "It is time to change the dressing on your shoulder," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. Taw sat up, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at the stitches the town doctor had put in grudgingly, but skillfully the night of the fire. He began to unbutton his shirt, his movements slow. "I can do it myself," he said. Though the protest lacked heat, it was a reflex, an old habit of solitude. "You can," Clara agreed, kneeling beside him. "But you will not." She pushed his hands away gently and finished undoing the buttons. When she peeled the fabric back, the bruising was a dark violet bloom across his copper skin, surrounding the angry red line of the bullet graze and the older, jagged scars of his past wars. Clara dipped a cloth into the warm water. She began to clean the wound, her touch firm but incredibly gentle. There was no hesitation in her hands. She traced the line of his muscle, washing away the dried blood and the lingering soot. Taw watched her face. She was biting her lip in concentration. A stray lock of hair had fallen across her forehead. "You have hands like a healer," Taw said, his voice rough. "Not a teacher. Teaching is healing," Clara said without looking up. "It is just healing the mind instead of the body. Both require you to clean out the dirt before you can close the wound." She applied a fresh poultice Nita had sent over a paste of sage and fat that smelled sharp and earthy. Taw hissed through his teeth as it touched the raw skin. "Sorry," Clara whispered. She began to wrap the clean linen bandage around his shoulder, leaning in close to pass the roll behind his back. For a moment, her cheek brushed against his chest. The contact was brief, but it sent a shock through both of them. Clara froze. Ta went very still. In the quiet of the hayloft, the only sound was their breathing and the distant hammer of carpenters working on the school roof. She did not pull away immediately. She finished tying the knot, her fingers lingering on the fabric. "I am sorry," Ta said. Clara sat back on her heels, meeting his eyes. "For what?" "For saving the school, for saving the children." "For the silence," Ta said. He looked down at his hands. "For the years I made Lila live in the shadows. I told myself I was protecting her. I told myself that if no one knew she was mine, she would be safe from the hate. I thought I was being a shield." He looked up, and his eyes were wet. "But a shield also blocks the light. I made her ashamed of her own blood, and I almost lost her because of it." Clara reached out and took his hand. His skin was rough, calloused from years of riding and fighting, but his grip was warm. "And I am sorry," Clara said softly. "I dragged you into this. I forced you to walk into that town, into that office. I knew the danger, and I pushed you anyway. I was so focused on winning the fight against Crow that I did not ask you what you had already lost." "You did not drag me, Clara," Ta said. He turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. "You woke me up. I was sleeping with my eyes open for 5 years. You made me remember that I am still alive." It was not a declaration of burning passion. It was something heavier, more grounded. It was an admission of shared survival. A small sound from the ladder made them turn. Lila was climbing up, her boots scuffing against the wood. She hesitated when she saw them holding hands, then stepped onto the loft floor. She walked over to them, holding her slate against her chest. She looked different today. The tight braids were gone, replaced by a single loose plait tied with a blue ribbon, a ribbon Clara had given her. "Lila," Ta said, gently pulling his hand from Clara's to open his arm to his daughter. "Come here." Lila sat between them. She looked at the fresh bandage on her father's shoulder. "Does it hurt, Papa?" she asked. "Only when I laugh," Ta said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Lila looked at Clara. "The boys at the pump, Thomas and the others, they asked me today if I knew how to shoot a bow. They did not say it meant, they just asked." "What did you tell them?" Clara asked. "I said no," Lila said. She looked down at her slate. "I told them I know how to draw, and I know how to read." She paused, tracing the grain of the wood floor. "I was scared. Teacher, before the fire, I thought if they knew I was Papa's girl, they would not let me sit by the stove. I thought I had to be just a girl, not a Comanche girl." Clara reached out and lifted Lila's chin so the girl had to look at her. "Listen to me, Lila," Clara said, her voice fierce and low. "You do not have to cut yourself in half to fit into this world. You do not have to choose between the schoolhouse and the prairie. You are not half a person. You are the whole sky." Lila's eyes widened. "The sky covers everything," Clara continued. "It covers the town and the reservation. It holds the sun and the storm. That is what you are. Do not ever let anyone tell you that you have to be small to belong." Lila looked at her father. Ta nodded, his expression filled with a pride so intense it looked like pain. "The whole sky," Ta repeated. Lila smiled. It was the first time Clara had seen a true, unguarded smile on the girl's face. It was radiant. The change in Dry Fork did not happen with a parade or a speech. It happened with lumber. In the days following the arrest of Silas Crow, the town realized 2 things. First, that they had been robbed blind for years, and second, that the money had been recovered because of a schoolteacher and a Comanche scout. It was a transaction of honor. The West understood debts. Reverend Miles stood in the pulpit on Sunday morning and did not preach about hellfire. He preached about neighbors. He announced that the collection plate would be used to buy nails and glass for the school, but it was more than money. On Tuesday, a wagon arrived from the sawmill. It was driven by the foreman of the largest cattle ranch in the valley, a man who had previously petitioned to have the school budget cut. He unloaded a stack of prime cedar planks. "For the roof," he grunted when Clara came out to thank him. Cedar holds up against hail better than pine. Don't want the little ones getting wet. He did not apologize for his past indifference. He simply left the wood. That was the apology. Nita came to the town 2 days later. It was rare for the midwife to leave the reservation boundaries, but she walked straight to the livery stable where Clara was grading papers. She brought a basket of dried meat and berries. She sat with Clara on the hay bales. "You speak the words of the books," Nita said, her milky eyes observing Clara. "But your tongue is stiff with our names." "I try," Clara admitted. "But the sounds are hard for me." "I will teach you," Nita said. "If you are to teach our children, you must know how to call them home. You must know the word for water and the word for respect." So, amidst the smell of horses, the lesson was reversed. The teacher became the student. Clara learned that Taa meant father, and Puha meant power or medicine. It was a small bridge, built of syllables, but it carried a weight that years of treaties had failed to achieve. 1 week after the fire, the stagecoach was loading in front of the general store. Lydia Bell stood by the door, surrounded by 3 large trunks. She was wearing a traveling suit of dove-gray wool, impeccable despite the dust. She was leaving Dry Fork, with Crow gone and exposed. Her saloon had lost its political protection. Lydia was a woman who knew when a vein of gold had played out. Clara was walking to the post office when she saw her. She hesitated, then walked over. Lydia saw her coming and adjusted her hat. "Here comes the conquering heroine," she said, though the venom was gone from her voice, replaced by a weary cynicism. "You are leaving?" Clara asked. "San Francisco," Lydia said. "The weather is better for my complexion, and the men have more money and less morals. It suits me." She looked at Clara, really seeing her. "You won, you know. I did not think you had the stomach for it. I thought you were just another starch-collared missionary." "I did not do it alone," Clara said. "No," Lydia agreed. "You had the wolf." She reached into her reticule and pulled out a small, rectangular box. She tossed it to Clara. Clara caught it. It was a box of high-quality French chalk, dustless, smooth, expensive. "Do not let them grind you down. Schoolteacher," Lydia said, climbing into the coach. "This town, they love you now because you saved their wallets, but they will forget. They always forget. Keep your spine stiff. Do not let them make you small again." The driver cracked the whip. The coach lurched forward. Lydia did not look back. Clara stood in the street, holding the box of chalk. It was a peace offering. It was a warning. It was respect. By the end of the month, the schoolhouse was nearly finished. The roof was new, glowing with the red hue of the cedar. The walls had been scrubbed, the scorch marks sanded down. Those shadows of the fire remained a reminder of what had been survived. Taw was working on the front door. His shoulder was stiff, but he could use the arm again. He was planning the wood, the shavings curling around his boots like blonde ribbons. He stopped when he saw Clara approaching with a basket of lunch. He looked at the horizon. The vast, open plain stretched out to the west, calling to him. For years, that horizon had been his only friend. It promised escape. It promised that if he just kept moving, the pain could not catch him. The marshal had told him he was free to go. The charges had been dropped. Thanks to the overwhelming testimony of the town, he could leave. He could go north to the Osage lands, or west to New Mexico. He could disappear again. He looked at the schoolhouse. He heard Lila's voice inside, helping Nita arrange the new books. He looked at Clara, who was setting out bread and cheese on a sawhorse. He felt the conflict war in his chest. The urge to run was a survival instinct honed by a decade of being hunted. Staying meant being seen. Staying meant being vulnerable. Staying meant that if things went wrong, he had something to lose. Clara looked up and caught him staring at the distance. She knew what he was thinking. She did not plead. She simply waited. Taw looked at the door he was building. It was solid. It had a strong latch. It was built to keep the winter out and the warmth in. He picked up the plane again. "The hinges are tight," he said to Clara. The wind will not blow this one open? Clara exhaled, a breath she didn't know she had been holding. That is good, she said. We get a lot of wind here. I am not going anywhere, Taw said. He did not look at her, focusing on the wood, but the words were loud enough. The roof needs another coat of tar before the snow, and Lila needs to finish her arithmetic. And the teacher? Clara asked, stepping closer. What does she need? Taw stopped working. He turned to her. He wiped the sawdust from his hands and reached out, brushing a smudge of charcoal from her cheek. His touch was no longer tentative. It was claiming. The teacher needs someone to make sure the fire does not go out, Taw said. They ate lunch sitting on the steps of the unfinished porch. It was a simple meal bread, cheese and apples. But as they ate, Thomas's father rode by and tipped his hat. Nita came out and sat with them. Lila ran out, laughing, holding a picture she had drawn of the new school. It was a domestic scene, ordinary and profound. The solitary Comanche scout, the stubborn schoolteacher, and the girl who was the whole sky. They were not just three people eating lunch. They were a family being stitched together. One nail, one lesson, and one meal at a time. The sun was warm. The smell of cedar was sharp and clean. For the first time in 100 years, the wind blowing through Dry Fork did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a song. The first snow of the season threatened to fall on the first Tuesday of November in the year 1890. The air was crisp, smelling of pine needles and the distant, smoky scent of hearth fires. But inside the newly rebuilt Dry Fork schoolhouse, the atmosphere was warm. The structure was solid now. The hasty repairs were made right after the fire had been reinforced. The walls were lined with fresh cedar planks that Silas Crow's replacement, a nervous but efficient man from Ohio, had signed off on without a single argument. The windows were new glass, clear and free of the grime that had plagued Clara's first days. But the most striking change was in the back corner of the room. It was no longer a dark place for the other children to hide. It was a gallery. Clara had taken a length of twine and strung it between two nails. Pinned to it were dozens of pieces of paper and slate rubbings. There were drawings of spotted ponies running through tall grass. There were sketches of the creek winding like a silver snake. There were clumsy, charcoal portraits of dogs and hawks, and one drawing clearly Lila's work of a woman with a high collar holding a book, standing next to a man with broad shoulders. Underneath the drawings, written on scraps of brown butcher paper, were words: horse, puku, river, hunu. The children had written them, English and Comanche. Side by side, the future was no longer being torn from their hands. It was being written by them, in two tongues. Clara stood at her desk, organizing the morning's lesson. She looked out the window. The town of Dry Fork looked different. The scars of the fire on the ground had been covered by the shifting earth and the early frost. The burned skeleton of the warehouse had been pulled down, the timber salvaged for firewood. Silas Crow was gone. He had not vanished into the night. He had been taken away in irons, escorted by two federal marshals who had been very interested in the contents of the black ledger. The trial in the district court had been short. The ledger spoke louder than any lawyer. It detailed every stolen blanket, every diverted sack of grain, every dollar squeezed from the people he was sworn to protect. The town had learned a hard lesson. For years, they had believed that the law was a gun on a hip or a badge on a chest. They had learned, through fire and ink, that the law could also be a shield, but only if one knew how to read the words and keep the books. The ranchers who had once scoffed at Clara's book learning now came to her in the evenings, asking her to check their grain receipts or read over their cattle sale contracts. They had realized that ignorance cost them money, and that was a price they were no longer willing to pay. The door opened, letting in a gust of cold air. Tall Redbird stepped inside. He wore a heavy wool coat over his buckskins, a concession to the changing season and to Clara's persistent nagging about his shoulder. He looked healthy. The hollow look in his cheeks was gone, replaced by the lean, hard vitality of a man who had a reason to wake up. "The woodpile is stacked high," Taw said, closing the door. Enough for the winner, even if it is a hard one. It will be a hard one, Clara said, smiling. The woolly worms are black this year. Ta walked to the front of the room. He ran his hand along the smooth wood of a new desk, one he had built himself. Lila is waiting with the horses, he said. The sun is going down. The light is good on the ridge. Clara put down her pen. Then we should not keep her waiting. They rode out of town, past the livery stable where the smith waved his hammer, past the general store where Lydia Bell's replacement was sweeping the boardwalk. They rode west, toward the rising ground that overlooked the valley. Lila rode a small pinto pony, a gift from her uncle on the reservation. She rode without a saddle, her legs gripping the animal's flanks with a natural ease. She laughed as the wind caught her hair that was no longer hidden under a bonnet, but braided with bright ribbons that matched the blue of the sky. They reached the crest of the hill as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the clouds in violent strokes of crimson and violet. Below them, Dry Fork was a scattering of toy blocks. Smoke rose from the chimneys in straight, gray columns. To the north lay the reservation, the tippies and cabins looking small and peaceful. To the south, the cattle ranches. From up here, there were no fences. There was just the land, rolling and endless, indifferent to the lines men drew on maps. Ta dismounted and helped Clara down. Lila slid off her pony and ran a little ways down the slope to look for late-blooming asters. Ta stood beside Clara, watching the town. I used to come up here to watch for soldiers, Ta said quietly. Then I came up here to watch for Crow's men. I was always looking for what was coming to hurt us. And now, Clara asked. Now, Ta said, turning to look at her. I am looking at the road. I am wondering if the snow will be too deep for the children to walk to school in January. I am wondering if we should build a shed for the horses. He paused, shifting his weight. For a man who could track a lizard across a rock face. He looked suddenly unsure of his footing. I am not a man of many words. Clara, he said, you know this. My words are usually sharp, like flint. I use them to cut. You have been using them to build lately, Clara said softly. Ta reached into the pocket of his coat. He pulled out a small object wrapped in a piece of soft doe skin. He held it out to her. Clara took it. She unfolded the leather. It was a bracelet. It was similar to the one he wore, the one that had first connected him to Lila in Clara's mind. But this one was different. It was wider. It was woven from 3 distinct strands of leather, one black, one red, and one natural tan. They were braided together so tightly that they formed a single, unbreakable cord. Woven into the center were beads of blue and white, forming the pattern of a river that flowed without end. It is not a ring, Ta said, looking at the horizon again, as if the sunset required his supervision. Gold is cold, and diamonds are just rocks. He took a breath and looked at her. His dark eyes were open, unguarded, filled with a terrifying amount of hope. Lila helped me braid it, he said. The 3 strands. They are us, you, me, and her, woven tight. Clara ran her thumb over the beadwork. It was exquisite. It represented hours of labor, hours of patience. If you stay, Ta said, his voice dropping to a murmur that the wind almost stole. I do not want you to stay as a guest. I do not want you to stay as a teacher who rents a room. If you stay, I want you to stay at home. He did not kneel. He did not recite poetry. He stood tall, offering her his life and his daughter's future with the same steady hands that had pulled her from the mud and fought a fire for her. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, hot and sudden. She looked at the bracelet, then at the man. I came here to fix things, Clara whispered. I came from St. Louis with my books and my high ideals. I thought I was going to save the poor, ignorant frontier from itself. I thought I was the one with the light. She stepped closer to him, closing the distance between their worlds. But I did not save anyone. Ta, you saved me. You and Lila. You taught me that courage is not standing on a podium. It is standing in the mud. You taught me that silence can be louder than shouting. She held out her wrist. Put it on me, she said. Ta's hands trembled slightly as he tied the leather thong around her wrist. It fit perfectly. It felt warm against her skin, a weight that grounded her. I am not going anywhere, Clara said, looking up into his face. This is my home. You are my home. Ta let out a breath that sounded like a broken dam. He leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. He did not kiss her, not yet. He just breathed her in, letting the reality settle into his bones. He was no longer the lonely Comanche. He was a man with a center. Teacher Lila came running up the hill, clutching a handful of dried wildflowers. She stopped when she saw them, her eyes darting to Clara's wrist. A smile broke across her face, a smile that was all Ta, but with a lightness he had lost years ago. You are wearing it, Lila breathed. I am, Clara said, kneeling down to be eye level with the girl. It is beautiful. Lila, thank you. Lila threw her arms around Clara's neck. It was a fierce hug, smelling of grass and childhood. I have a name for you, Lila whispered into Clara's ear. Clara pulled back slightly. Oh, is Miss Bennett too long? Lila shook her head. She looked at Clara with a serious, solemn expression. She remembered her mother a shadow, a warmth from long ago. She would never replace that, but Clara was something else. Clara was the fire in the stove. Clara was the hand holding the chalk. Teacher Clara, Lila said firmly. Then she added, in a voice that bridged the gap between the schoolhouse and the teepee. Family. It was a title higher than any degree Clara could have earned in the East. It was an adoption. It was a crowning. Family, Clara repeated, her voice thick. Yes, we are. Ta placed his large hand on Lila's shoulder, and his other hand on Clara's. The three of them stood on the hill as the sun finally vanished, leaving a twilight that was purple and soft. They were a strange configuration, a white woman from the city, a Comanche warrior with a scarred past and a child of two worlds, but as the first star appeared in the west, they looked like the only thing that mattered. They looked like a foundation. Winter came to Dry Fork 3 weeks later. It came with a vengeance, burying the plains in 2 feet of snow, but the schoolhouse was warm. The new stove, a cast-iron beast purchased with the recovered funds, roared in the center of the room. The smell of cedar and wood smoke was a perfume that Clara would forever associate with safety. It was late, long after the children had gone home. The wind was howling outside, scratching at the new door, but the latch held. Clara was at her desk. She was preparing the roster for the next term. She opened the drawer. Inside lay the black ledger. It was no longer a book of crimes. It had been repurposed. Clara opened the front cover. The first 20 pages, the pages filled with Silas Crow's lies and theft, had been torn out. She had crumpled them up and used them to start the fire on the first cold morning of the season. The corruption of the past had served only to warm the room for a few minutes before turning to ash. The remaining pages were clean. Clara dipped her pen in the inkwell. On the last page, the page that had once been intended to record the sale of illegal whiskey, she began to write. Student roster, spring term, 1891. She wrote the names, Thomas Miller, Sarah Hart, Samuel Redfeather, Lila Redbird. She wrote them in her elegant, looping script. The paper that had once been an instrument of greed was now a record of hope. The old power had been broken and turned into a table for the future. The door opened softly. Ta walked in, stomping the snow from his boots. He carried a pail of fresh water and a basket of dinner Nita had sent cornbread and venison stew. He did not speak. He simply walked to the stove, added a log, and set the kettle on top. He moved with the quiet assurance of a man who belonged exactly where he was. He came to the desk and stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. He looked down at the roster. It is a long list, he said. It is a good list, Clara replied, leaning her head back against him. She looked at the new blackboard. It was pristine. Black slate, waiting for the morning. Clara stood up. She picked up a piece of the French chalk Lydia Bell had given her. It felt smooth and cool in her fingers. She walked to the board. "What are you writing?" Taw asked, watching her. "A reminder," Clara said. "For them, and for us." She wrote 3 short sentences. The chalk made a soft, rhythmic sound, like a heartbeat. "We learn. We live. We belong." She finished the last letter and lowered her hand. White chalk dust drifted down from the board, settling on the floor, on her skirt, on Taw's boots. It fell softly, silently, covering the memory of the soot and the ash. It looked like snow, but in the glow of the firelight, it did not look cold. It looked like warm snow. Taw walked over to her. He took the chalk from her hand and set it on the tray. He took her face in his hands and kissed her. It was a kiss that tasted of the winter wind and the warm fire, of the past they had survived and the future they were building. Outside, the storm raged, burying the world in white. But inside, the fire was bright, the roster was full, and the lonely Comanche was lonely no more. The lesson was finished. Life had just begun. Thank you so much for listening to the story, Can You Be My Date for One Day? It has been a journey through the dust, the fire, and the healing of the Wild West. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. Are you listening from a bustling city, a quiet countryside, or somewhere in between? Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on Clara and Taw's journey. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of the frontier, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Don't forget to hit the like button and press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners and travel further than a tumbleweed in a gale. Thank you for being part of our campfire circle. Until the next trail.